All right, hello everyone. Welcome back as we continue our video devotional series on Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, in the last section, we began Paul's the beginning of his letter, the beginning where Paul is starting to explore the subject of human sinfulness, and there we learned that God is angry, that God's wrath is revealed from heaven against the unrighteousness of human beings. And he is angry because the unrighteousness of human beings is an enemy to truth, and it's an enemy to the work that God is doing in the world. And after Paul informs us of that, he gives us the reason why and goes to explain that unrighteousness, and he plots the growth of evil and sin in the world, and shows how the infection has taken hold, how human beings, how they should have known better by creation revealing the goodness and glory of God, but human beings preferring their own foolishness to God's wisdom, turned away and then began to mistake the creature for the creator and began to worship idols instead of worshiping and following God. Now today, as Paul continues this letter, he starts to show us the full extent and the totality of that evil and how it has infected the world and the great impact it has made in the entire course of history. And what he explains here is a doctrine that we properly call total depravity. It's a doctrine of total depravity. And it's not a doctrine that means that that everything we do is just awful, we're totally depraved human beings that have nothing but evil in us, but just a doctrine to explain or to describe the fallen state of humanity, that everything we do is touched and tainted with evil. As in, this human sinfulness touches us to the very core of our being. And that's what Paul is describing here in these next few verses in Romans. Now, we're going to be picking up Romans chapter 1, beginning at verse 26, going to verse 32. So what I'd like for you to do right now is take a minute, open your Bible, look at these verses, chapter 1, verses 26 to 32. Make any notes, any questions that might stand out to you, underline any verses that seem important, or any words that your eyes kind of just gravitate towards or your mind fixated on. And just wanted you to pause the video and take a chance to read that and get some first impressions of Romans 1, 26 to 32. All right, everyone, hopefully you've had time to look through those verses and read completely through 26 and 32, and you've developed your first impressions of this passage already. What Paul is talking about here in these verses is showing us the full extent of the sin problem. He's just showing us how deep and just how pervasive sin has become in human society. That this is a big problem. It's not just people doing something wrong here and there and just making little disturbances of our life. This problem is something that has consumed all of human nature. Now let's start breaking it down a little in smaller chunks at a time. I'm going to start reading here at verse 26. And that's what Paul says: "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions." And this reason he's talking about is referring back to what we discussed in the last lesson of people giving up the worship of God for worshiping idols. And so it's for this reason God gave them, the unrighteous, up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, of course, what Paul is talking about here is human sexuality. He's using human sexuality to describe to us just the deep impact that sin has made in our life. Now, human sexuality is a deep instinct. It is something that people have even called primal, a primal instinct. It's something that goes to the very core of our being. It is something that is just as deep as essential as the instincts for fear and the instincts for hunger. So this goes right to the very center and the very basics and the foundations of who we are, and that's human sexuality. Now, what he's describing here is a same-sex relationship. And what Paul is saying is, in these same-sex relationships, men and women are giving up a natural sexual relationship, which is a man desiring a woman and a woman desiring man, and they're taking up an unnatural sexual relationship, which is a woman sexually desiring another woman and a man sexually desiring another man. Now, what's significant about this is that he is talking about the sexual instinct. And it is a deeply important instinct that human beings possess, because it is by sexual instinct and through the practice of sexuality that we procreate the species. Our culture has become so inundated with sex and with sexual images. They use it in advertising. They use it a lot in movies. They use it in sales. And we're just flooded with images of sexuality and just so bombarded by it. And in our culture, it has almost become a bit of a pastime. And in this, we have forgotten just the deeply important role that sex plays in human life, and that is the survival of the species. If men and women were to stop having sex with one another, then the human species would disappear. In the amount of time it takes for the last person to die, there would be no more human beings left on this earth. So it's impossible to divorce the procreative function from human sexuality. And we can just tell, just looking at that, the purpose of human sexuality, and that is the procreation and the continuation of our species. Not to say that's the only function, but that is its prime function. And that kind of function and that desire goes down deep into the core of who we are. And so what Paul's talking about here, with men being inflamed with lust for other men and women being inflamed with lust for other women, giving up a natural relationship for something that is unnatural, is showing us how deep the corruption of sin goes. That this sin that has pervaded society, has pervaded the world, has gotten into us. It's gotten into us so deeply that it's had a chance to touch and corrupt even the sexual instinct. And that means it is cut into us in a place that is deep and that is primal. And that is how great and pervasive sin has become. It's corrupted us to the very core of our being. And that means that sin now has gotten so deep into us, it actually touches our desires. It touches our feelings and our desires. And that's the situation that we call total depravity. A total depravity, that sin has touched our entire being. It's touched the core of who we are. It's actually changed us on a fundamental level. Now, because it's touched our desires, we find ourselves in a difficult situation. Because sin has touched and because it's corrupted and twisted our desires, we cannot trust those desires. A famous piece of advice people love to throw out today is, you got to follow your heart. You got to do what feels right to you. Or sometimes people say, well, just something that feels as good can't be wrong. Well, what Paul reminds us of here is that's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. You cannot follow your feelings. You cannot follow and trust your desires, because your feelings and desires have been tainted with sin, just like everything else has been touched and tainted with sin. It's not just our thoughts. Our very desires now are tainted with sin. So we cannot use those to help direct us in life and to show us what is good and what is right and what is true. Now, in a world without sin, if we had no sin upon us, then we could trust our desires. We could follow our heart. We could do what feels right, because what felt right would be right. But since now that we have been corrupted with sin, and since that this corruption has gone so deep that it touches the core of our being, we cannot trust our desires. We have to look for some other guide and direction to show us what is right and what is wrong. Now, if this situation wasn't bad enough, it actually gets worse, because out of this corruption of our being, out of that grows every other evil that human beings commit on the earth. And Paul gives us this whole litany of them. Here, let's look down to 28, verse 28 to 32. This is what Paul says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Now this is a whole big list of sin that Paul lists out. And it's not meant to be a comprehensive list of sins. What it's meant to be is to show just how great sin has taken over this world. Out of our abandoning of God, of recognizing Him as God and worshiping it as God, we've allowed sin to corrupt our very nature. And since sin has corrupted our very nature, now all manner of evil is open up, and it's beginning to get practiced into the world. And how did this all begin? It began because we did not acknowledge God as God. We did not acknowledge God as God, and we worshiped a creature rather than the Creator. We turned from Him and decided to follow after our own ways. And what happened was we became foolish. We became deceived, because it says in Scripture the foundation of wisdom, the very beginning of wisdom, is a fear of the Lord. Is a fear of the Lord and an obedience of the Lord. And unless we obey Him, unless we fear God, unless we let Him be the start and the foundation and the font of our wisdom, then we're going to do nothing but get deceived in the world and just get pulled into our own desires. Now, after all this evil comes out, it actually gets worse after that. So not only is evil going to be spread all over the world like we see today, something even worse happens. This is here, verse 32. I want to read to you again. It says, though they know God's righteous decree, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they do not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So not only do we have a world where people are going out and doing all manner of evil because the core of their being has been corrupted. Not only do they go out and do awful evil things, but they praise the works of evil as good. They celebrate them. They say they're wonderful. And that's where we may have gotten to a situation you may have noticed today, that all manner of sin and evil is being celebrated in the world, and is being held up and lauded and praised as a virtue. Because now what has happened is we've had the total immersion of human nature has been just completely soaked in sin and evil. So our nature has been changed. All sorts of manners, and any manner you can think of evil is done in the world. And not only is evil done, we praise evil as good. And we say that those that are doing these evil things are doing something good. And we take what is naturally and should be a vice, and we lift it up and we applaud it as a virtue. And that is total depravity. And that's the situation that we're faced with. It wasn't just the situation that Paul was faced with the Romans. That's the situation that continues today, the situation that we see ourselves in this moment, in this day and age, in January of 2020. Now, in case you're starting to feel superior, in case you look at all these sins and all this litany, and especially as it talks about certain sexual sins, and you want to feel superior to them and say, well, I don't do this. Look at all these awful and wicked people that are out here populating the earth. In case you're starting to feel that way, Paul's about to turn the tables on you completely. Because as soon as we pick up in chapter 2, the accusation, that the finger pointing that we tend to point out outside of ourselves, that finger is about to be turned in on ourselves. And we are about to understand the extent of total depravity doesn't just touch the world, it touches us too. And we also bear the guilt of sin, and we share it with the whole world. So, thank you for joining me again this time. I hope you will be with us as we look ahead to chapter 2. But until then, I want you to just take time out of your life, if you could, and reflect a little bit on this passage. And especially reflect on the question of how can we escape this cycle of total depravity in the world? Is there anything that we can do as people to escape this cycle of total depravity? Well, thanks for joining us, and I hope you will join us for the next one.